Hey everyone, welcome to 4-bar orchestration analysis. Today we're going to be looking at 4 bars from the third movement of my Burung suite called Songbird, the audio of which can be found on YouTube. So I chose this particular section because it's a kind of composite of dovetailing, part writing, counterpoint, and it's a little intricate. I think it works pretty well. I heard this piece performed live and it seemed to work out pretty well. So first we'll listen to it and then I'll just explain what's going on. Right. So harmonically it's pretty simple. It's just sort of 6 going to 1 and then a kind of 2-5-1 where we modulate from C sharp minor to E major, which is the relative major. You know, pretty straightforward, a kind of typical jazz progression. So there are several components to this texture, although I try not to violate my rule of 4, where I don't generally have more than 4 ideas happening simultaneously unless I'm very careful contrapuntally to make them work together with each other. So first we have the melody, which is in the bass. Notice how I mark it up, forte. It's in the bass playing pizzicato, which is a kind of a development of the melody that came before. And so the bass plays a dual role. First, it plays the melody, and then it just goes to a simple sort of quarter note bass line, right? So there's nothing wrong with switching the function in a short period of time as long as your voice leading is smooth. And anytime you have a melody down low, sometimes you risk it getting covered up by other things that are happening in the low register or dynamic things that are happening. And so the ways that I try and mitigate against this is dynamic levels. Notice how all of the upper parts are at mezzo forte and the vibraphone is at piano, whereas the contrabass is at forte. So that helps it come out of the texture even though it's sort of at the bottom end and our ear oftentimes gravitates towards the higher things. And another thing contributing to it being able to be heard is that there isn't anything else happening in the low register. It's literally just this bass line and then things sort of floating on top. And so the fact that I sort of carve out frequency space for it, I think helps it be heard. Just listen for that. Right? It just is by itself down there, and there's a lot of space between it and the upper parts. And this also helps mitigate against overtone issues. Your bass line is very important in that not only can it be a melodic line horizontally, and not only does it need to play some functional part of the harmony, but it also changes inversion, right? So if you have like a passing tone or something dissonant that doesn't function substantively with the harmony in an upper voice, it's less consequential because in some sense its overtones are only affecting what's above it. And so the higher something is, the less obviously there is that is above it by definition of it being high. And so the bass line, because everything is above the bass line can often make things muddy. And so the fact that there's so much space between the bass line and the upper parts in this texture allows the bass line to have a kind of melodic freedom that doesn't muddy up the upper parts in a way that it would if there was more mid-range stuff happening, if that makes sense. I often like to take blippity textures like this and just sort of fill in some kind of light, clear harmonization. Not anything, but oftentimes I use 7th chords a lot, and so I like to have these kind of accompanimental figurations, because with the 7th chord you have, well, first off, I don't just want to have chords, because that's boring, right? And I don't just want to have a block chord, because there's no rhythmic motion. So one thing that I like to do is figure out the various ways in which you can take the 4 notes of a 7th chord and turn it into sort of 2-2. Right? So you can go, or you could go, right? There are lots of different ways you can take a chord and turn it into a little figuration like that. And that's what happens with the vibraphone here. The vibraphone with its pedal down, which is what I'm indicating by the slurs. I think in the final score, which this isn't, I added the pedal indications, but the vibraphone has a nice kind of warm but not too intrusive kind of ringing sine wavy quality that works really well for supporting harmonically light textures like this where you don't want it to sort of pop out the way that brass or string instruments might. right? So a couple of little details here. One, notice how I have the 9/8. Yada, da, 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 da. The reason that I do that as opposed to going yada, da, 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 one, it makes it interesting. I like the 9/8 sound. It's kind of pretty. And the other thing is that the 9/8, well, the 9 on top of the A major chord is B, right? And I carry over the B so that we get a C sharp minor 7. And so I like the kind of consistency with function change, as I like to call it, where the B is playing the 9th of the A major chord, and then it stays and then plays the 7th of the C sharp minor chord. And that consistency gives us kind of an emotional progression that I like, right? Which wouldn't be the case if it was merely just, you know, it would not be the case if it was merely just this, right? So that's why my thought process for that. And then rather than just sort of taking the same figuration and moving it up to F sharp minor, I voice lead it, right? So here we have fifths, here we have fourths, switching to a kind of tritone to fifth, which works well with the dominant 7, right? And then I pop up to E major 7 because I want the kind of shimmer, so I violate my own rule in this case. And then even though it's just E major for the whole bar, rather than keeping it the same, I kind of invert it downward. Right, which kind of sounds a little bit something like from the Never Ending Story, for any of you who have seen that. So that's what I was thinking about with that little very simple accompanimental configuration, and it's just playing chord tones. You know, so it's and the 9th of a major chord and the 7th of a minor chord are very mild chord tones. They don't create any sharp minor seconds or major sevenths or tritones with the other parts. So it creates a nice solid but clean bed for other things to happen on top. And then we just sort of have this figuration, which is essentially just sixths, parallel sixths, which work really well, that kind of follow the harmony in a little triplet figuration. Right, notice how rather than have this part being played by the flute, which would be too low in its register to pop out, we have the flute up in the ledger line so it can project, and we have the oboe down in its sort of meteor register, because the oboe thins out as it gets higher and the flute thins out as it gets lower. So this is kind of an optimal register for them both, and I like the contrast. And then we have a repetition of the same figuration, but with a slight texture change. It's little changes like these that I think can make a big difference. You can keep the same texture with regards to notes, you know, across a section of 4 or even 8 bars, but if you swap what instruments are playing it and what octave, it gives it a sense of change that is organic and keeps it lively without changing it so much that there isn't a relationship between one thing and the next. And so we have the same thing with the piccolo and the flute. And the thing that I like about this particular setup, this piccolo and flute, is that the piccolo at the start is a bit louder than the flute, just by merit of it being higher and the fact that it's in a decent register. You know, the flute is higher relative to its range. But once we get down to the lower register, the piccolo kind of loses its shrillness and kind of subsumes itself into the texture. And the flute is still in its ledger line area and still has projection, and so the flute kind of pops out. So this is kind of three-dimensional shift where the flute becomes louder just timbrally across this little section, and at the same time that the piccolo gets quieter. Or rather, I should say the flute kind of stays the same and the piccolo gets quieter, meaning that the flute will pop out. So that's a nice little detail that I like. And then there's this crazy woodwind dovetailing figuration. And this is something that would not be possible with a single woodwind instrument, but if you dovetail it across various woodwinds, it's something that, for example, Holst does in Mercury, you know, which had a huge, that movement of the planets had a huge influence on my woodwind writing for this piece. And it's always important when dovetailing to give one note of overlap. Otherwise, there's a tendency for it to sound like ba-da-da, dee-da-da, ga-da-da, dee-da-da-da, right? Whereas if you want it to sound like a continuous line, both for the sake of rhythmic accuracy and giving the players a kind of strong beat to land on, and also the timbral overlap is important. So first we have this one. Right, which is a kind of mixture of harmonic notes and scales. It's not just scales, but it's mostly harmonic notes, right? So like, for example, right, this essentially is just an A major arpeggio with a little passing tone, and notice that the passing tone is at the B, which exists in the vibraphone as a part of the harmony anyway, right? Here we have an A major seventh, right? Same thing here, A major seventh, right? In this case, I added a little bit of a Lydian passing tone. The D sharp is the sharp 4 scale degree of A Lydian. And notice how I didn't, that's a kind of sharp dissonance because it creates not only a major second with the C sharp in the chord, but it also creates a minor second or major seventh, depending upon the octave placement between the D sharp and the E. And it also creates a tritone between the root of the chord. D sharp to A is a tritone, right? So I waited until we got a little bit higher before I added that more dissonant note because, again, the higher you are in range, the less dissonance has a muddiness effect, right? Right, here's kind of a pentatonic thing. Right, and here it's just full stepwise motion. Right, so and I often like to do that to sort of create lines that start out arpeggiatically and then they morph into more melodic, aka stepwise motion, the higher they get, to give it a kind of sense of climacticness. So see if you can hear those just chord tones and passing tones and things. Right? And then we have a similar kind of thing here, except for it matches the new harmony. And notice how I made it a little bit different. I didn't want it to keep like the same exact contour the second time. Right? And also notice how I know that I'm going to get into this section, so look at how I led this oboe right into the next line. Right? Little voice leading details like that are imperative. When amateur composers create intricate textural setups like this with lots of things happening, they have a tendency to think in blocks and not think about leading one section into the next section in the smoothest way possible. And if you add all that after the effect, it tends to sound contrived. Whereas if you're mindful of that as you're composing the section, you can come up with something that is both musically satisfying in addition to being technically feasible for the players and satisfying as a linear line to play. Because you got to realize that this isn't just some orchestra in which you can sort of like, you know, tell like a computer program to do exactly what you want it to do, right? These are human beings, and each player, the flute doesn't see any of the other parts. They can hear it, but they're just playing the flute line, right? So to some extent, you want to give them just a satisfying line to play in and of itself, right? And that's something that I really try hard to do in my orchestrations, okay? So yeah, so just to reiterate, we have the contrabass playing the melody, we have the vibraphone playing a simple harmonic arpeggiation configuration kind of thing. We have the flute 2 and oboe 2, and then later switching to piccolo and flute playing these little triplet figurations, and then these lower woodwinds culminating in the oboe playing this giant dovetailed line. And it all intervallically works together, in addition to the fact that the triplet rhythm helps to differentiate this from interfering. And also notice how once we sort of get into in a kind of register where, you know, the dovetail line is going to get so high that it's going to start to interfere intervallically with the flutes and oboes, that's when I swap, right? So that's another reason why I switched to having the flutes and piccolos play the thing up an octave. It's so that it leaves room for this stuff to happen. You don't want to have this messiness where notes are piling on top of each other. The only exception to that is if you have two sufficiently differentiated timbres and you are very careful to make sure that the counterpoint is intervallically clean, right? So if I have like an oboe and maybe like, I don't know, maybe a violin, they can voice cross and sort of get in each other's way because they're sufficiently different timbrally for you to be able to differentiate them using your ears. And as long as you make sure that if you have dissonances, that you resolve them in a satisfying contrapuntal way by oblique motion, by stepwise motion. Otherwise, it just gets too messy and it just sounds not clean, right? So we'll go ahead and listen to these first two bars. And this next part, I do what's kind of a principle of composition that I follow, where keep some things the same and change some things, right? So you'll notice that the vibraphone keeps on going, playing its arpeggiatic configuration, gluing the two sections together. As I pointed out earlier, we have the same type of dovetailed configuration, albeit with a slightly different contour, right? The only difference is that we now take that melody, that melody is now placed in the upper parts, right? And it's essentially just playing homogeneous kind of four-part writing, right? So first we have it in the pizzicato, and notice how when the melody sort of chills out, I take what was playing a part and I just give it a little bit of a kind of contrapuntal line, and the reason that I do that is because there's space for it to happen rhythmically, right? So that sounds like this. Right? Doubled with the harp. Right? And then the cello starts off, but then drops out for the second half. This is both to lighten it up and to give them adequate preparation to switch to arco for the next section. And then finally, all of that is doubled in the upper winds, the clarinet, flute, 1 and 2, and piccolo. Right, and again, notice how I'm not giving them new lines. I'm just taking this I can't remember whether or not it's 3 or 4-part writing. I think it's 3-part writing, including the bass 4-part writing. But this kind of 3-part chordal structure, which I composed in sketch format at the piano, right? I made sure that all the notes and harmonies worked out, and then I extrapolated it onto the pizzicato strings, and then I took those lines and doubled them in good ranges across the flutes and piccolos and clarinets, right? You want to be careful to not add a bunch of different lines happening simultaneously. It's usually best to just compose a small number of parts that work like clockwork together, as I've said before, and then extrapolate them in the best way that you can as an orchestrator, and maybe add a little bit of embellishment. But if you add too many parts, it not only does it complicate it makes it less powerful and less clear, and it just prevents your ears from hearing individual lines contributing together, and it makes it sound more just kind of a blah, right? Yeah, so add the pizzicato bass and the vibraphone. It sounds like this. And then the arpeggiatic dovetailing is icing on the cake. So I'll play the section leading up to it. So there you go. That's 4 bars of Songbird. A little analysis. I'm looking forward to doing this series because I think the videos are small enough that it's nice to have little kind of tidbits. It's easier for me to make them, and then I can sort of pick and choose specific moments from my music. Let me know if you like this series in the comments what 4 bars from my own music you'd like to see. I'll still do the Let's Write John Williams and things like that. How to write like John Williams. But for this series, I'm just going to be doing little 4-bar, maybe, it could be flexible, maybe 6 bars, but like around approximately 4 bars of music that I've written in the past. So if there are moments of any of the pieces that I have on YouTube where you're like, I want to know what his thought process was for those 4 bars, just let me know in the comment section, and I'll put it on a list of priorities, and I will see you in the next episode. Adios.